This is Dr. Ted Hildebrandt in his teaching on John Elliott, 1604 to 1690, Apostle to the Indians. This is session number 3, the Elliott Bible, 1663, second edition, 1685, King Philip's War, 1675, and Starting Over, and then finally, Final Tributes to John Elliott. Welcome back to our third session on the life and work of John Elliott from 1604 to 1690, the Apostle to the Indians in Massachusetts, Roxbury, Massachusetts, and Natick. Our first session, we looked at his significance in the murals that are present in the State House of Boston, also on the Beacon Street, carved into marble, put with the Mayflower Compact and to the level of the founding of Harvard University. We traced his beginnings from Whitford, where he was born, 1604, to Nasing, where he spent his childhood for 10 years, and then up to Cambridge University at 14 years of age, and then graduated from there in about 1622. From then, there was several years in between. He apparently became a minister, was ordained, and then over to Thomas Hooker's house in Little Bad Hour. Thomas Hooker then goes to Europe and then goes over to Boston and the New World. And Elliott follows about a year later in 1631 on the Lion ship, goes into Boston Harbor, and then goes into the First Church of Boston, where he substitute ministered for John Wilson, who was going back to England to see if he can convince his wife to come over. He did 1 year stint at the First Church of Boston, just outside the Boston Gardens on Commonwealth Street there till this day. And then he went to Roxbury, where the people from Nasing that he promised, his childhood group and his own family, came over and settled in Roxbury. So he moves after 1 year in Boston down to Roxbury, where he spent basically the rest of his life. So from 0 to 27, he was in England. He comes over 1 year, when he's 28, and then from 28 on till he's 86, he spends in Roxbury. We also then looked at his 12-year stint at Roxbury, where he focused on the church. He had 6 children. Hannah Mumford, they were married. She came over and they were married and had 6 children. And then around the 1640s, 43 or thereabouts, he started learning the Indian language and had a passion for the Indians. And in 1646 then, he goes, and this was our second session then, was on Wabon's Wigwam, where in 1646, October, he goes and basically starts preaching in Algonquin language to those people and to the Indian people at Newtown, or Nonatam, as it was called then, or Newton, which is called today. They then basically, the Indians asked him questions, and he preached there for a fortnight. Every other week, he would go over from Roxbury and travel over to that Newton area. And then basically they asked for some land, and they gave them, the governor's board and whatever, the general court there gave them land out in Natick. And so Natick becomes his first praying Indian village. And he sets up the village, as we said, with the groups of 10, groups of 50, groups of 100. And then starts catechizing the Indians. And after that was about 1650 when Natick came online. And then about 1660 then, this is 10 years later, he founds the first church. In other words, he didn't run in, just found the church. They set up the building, they built a bridge over the Charles River, there was all sorts of, they built a meeting house, they built a place for him to stay so that he could stay over and things and teach them. And that was at Natick. So Natick was kind of the place, and even till this day, I think we showed some video and some things of the rock that's there, and the church, the Elliott Church, and the Free Bacon Library, and historical obelisk that's there in Natick. There's also at the Natick Post Office is one of the great murals of John Elliott in the Natick Post Office. Now, And then in about 1674, he and Daniel Gookin traveled around and visited. They basically took the Natick model and upscaled it until 14 villages, praying Indian villages, were founded. And in the 1674, then he and Daniel Gookin went around and visited each one of those villages. And now we're going to look at today, 1675. And this is critical. This is King Philip's War. And this is everything went in the tank after this. This is the King Philip's War upset everything. And we'll have to talk about that. But before we do, we want to talk about Eliot's greatest achievement, and that is the Elliott Bible, or the Algonquin or Wampanoag Bible that was published in 1663. And so this was the Bible in their language. First time, and I think the last time it was ever done. And so Eliot did that, and so we want to look and weigh that. This is viewed as his greatest achievement of translating the Bible from probably Hebrew and Greek and English into the Indian language, which is extremely difficult language, and he did that over a process of years. 1663, and this is about 14 years after he was been preaching and things like that to the Indians. So let me read what Thomas Thorogood said in June 18th, 1653. And this is when Eliot's writing to this Thomas Thorogood and telling him his desire to put the Bible into their language. So Eliot writes to Thomas Thorogood, 1653, quote, "I have a great longing and desire, if be the will of God, taught our Indian language might be sanctified by the translation of the Holy Scriptures into it, but I fear it will not be obtained in my days." In other words, he looks at 1653, he looks at it, 10 years later he's going to have the Bible done, but he looks at it as just a monumental task. He says, I don't think it's going to happen in my days. And he says, I cannot stick to the work because of my necessity attendance to my ministry in Roxbury and among the Indians at sundry places. So he was traveling around to all these Indian villages, and he said, I don't think I'm going to be able to pull it off. I won't see it in my day. But that was his passion. He did basically a catechism and a grammar, and but you got to remember, this guy's about 40 years old and on, trying to learn this Algonquin, an extremely hard language. And so he's not like a youngster in his 20s kind of learning this, and he worked on it for about 12 years. The Indian question that drove him was, how do I get to heaven? And he basically said, read the Bible, hear what Jesus says, and pray. And he realized that they couldn't read the Bible in their own language. They didn't have a written language. There was no literature. There was nothing. And so basically he had to start from scratch. And so this is a tremendous thing. He had translations that he developed for the Catechism first. He did the Lord's Prayer, which, when you're developing things, the Lord's Prayer is what you're going to start with, a Catechism, and then also the Ten Commandments. And those were critical founding things. And he had the help of this Kokanu, this Indian that was in his house, that they basically worked on teaching. Kokanu worked on teaching him the language. Kokanu knew both English and Algonquin and helped him in the translation process. In 1649, 3 years after his sermons at Wabon's Wigwam, 3 years later, he was stomping for Indian schools, the urgent need for Indian schools. He quote, "I do very much desire," he added, "to translate some parts of Scripture into their language, and to print some primer in their language wherein to initiate and teach them to read." So he was developing materials that would be able to, they couldn't read their own language. It had never been written down. So he had to teach them to read their own language. And such a thing will be troublesome and chargeable, and I have not the means of my own for it. And so basically he says, I can't do all this, but that he knew, and he was just taking step by step to move in that direction. The cost of printing was a block for him. In 1658, he wrote, "The whole book of God is translated into their own language. It wanted but revising, transcribing, and printing. Oh, that the Lord would so move that by some means or other it may be printed." And largely he didn't have the funds for it or the ability to print. And so this was a big block, but he had it done, and so he was really excited about that. How could it ever be printed? He had a slender salary and could not pay for it. A letter to England in 1651, he says, with much sorrow, I have no hope to see my Bible printed in my days. And so he had just realized he couldn't pull it. He wrote the Society for the Propagating of the Gospel, asking for help. In September of 1661, the New Testament was printed in the Algonquin language in Cambridge, Massachusetts. 3 years after this or so, in 1663, the whole Bible will be printed. It will be printed at Cambridge. Cambridge is where Harvard University is today. And it will be printed actually in the basement of the Indian College. It was the first brick building at Harvard University. In the basement of that, they housed the printing press. And Samuel Green, famous name of a famous printer who printed all these things back in that generation. These are the first generation, okay? These guys didn't have barely enough food to eat and stuff and things. So Samuel Green having this printing press going was a big deal. And then they had this Marmaduke Johnson came over, and Marmaduke Johnson had a 3-year contract to come over to Boston to Cambridge and basically print for 3 years this Elliott Bible that was printed in 1663. 200 copies in plain, strong leather were printed and immediately put into circulation to the Indians. Elliott's joy when he went to Natick and saw the Bible in their hands was like Simon in the Nunc Dimittis. And remember Simon when he picked up the baby Jesus. It was like, this is my life, man. It was like, and quote from Simeon in Luke chapter 2 says, now, Lord, lettest thy servant depart in peace, for my eyes have seen thy salvation. And so it was with Eliot that when he saw and actually had in his hands the Bible that he had translated, kind of de novo, out of nothing, just working with the translation and things, it was like this was the accomplishment of his life. And now, let my soul depart in peace. So Samuel Green was involved. Samuel Green brought over with him in 1628. There was a printing press, the 1628 printing press that Samuel Green had been printing all this stuff on. A new press was sent over in 1654, and this was engaged Marmaduke Johnson. So you had Samuel Green, Marmaduke Johnson, and then the other one is Printer James, and I'll talk to him about a second. There was an Indian. This was the Indian College, and it was in the Indian College where this printing was going on. There's a guy named Printer James, and actually they call him James Printer, took on that as his last name, and he was an Indian that actually helped proof this to make sure that it was correct and things like that. And he will be one of the early heroes, the Indian who actually helped print the Bible. They printed, in 1663, there were 1,000 copies of Elliott's Bible was printed. 1,000 copies. They sent, I think, 26 back to England, and King James was presented with this. In 1658, Eliot wrote the treasurer of the society, quote, I shall not trouble you with anything at present save this one business of the moment, touching the printing of the Bible in the Indian language, that you yourselves might be moved to hire some honest young man who has skill to compose, and more skills, another part of the work, the better. Send him over as your servant, and pay him there to his content, and engage payment, and let him serve you here in New England at the press at Harvard College, and work under the college printer, Samuel Green, and in impressing the Bible in the Indian language, and with him send a convenient stock of paper to begin with all. So they sent over, I think it was 100 reams or something like that, of paper, and it just needed the paper to print. You can imagine these guys are the first settlers, and so they don't have a lot of paper and things like that manufactured and things. And so it's just it's interesting. One recent book by Bengi and Pickowitz, I'm probably mispronouncing their names, but it says, in the course of 1,000 years since Alpheus, that's since 311 to 383, constructed the Gothic alphabet. So Alpheus in the 300s developed this Gothic script, this Gothic alphabet. And what these people notice is that Eliot was the only missionary to devise a new alphabet from an unwritten language for the purpose of teaching and preaching the scriptures. So it had been over 1,000 years since anybody had developed an alphabet to describe what he was hearing, the Indians. He had to come up with some new letters. And so as I was scanning in this thing, I came across 2 zeros, and I noticed they were close to one another. And after a while, I began to realize, no, they're actually 2 zeros compressed together, and that was one of his new symbols for this sound that he was hearing in the Algonquin language. So he made up new letters that would capture the sound of these people. That had not been done for 1,000 years. And Eliot did this. It is amazing what he did, but his passion for this. In 1611, of course, the King James Version came out. 1611. We're talking now 1663, so it's about, 50 years later. But the King James Version had 54 scholars, and it took them 7 years. 54 scholars in the King James Version. It took them 7 years to do it. Eliot did his work and completed in 14 years. One man, John Eliot, translated the whole Bible into Algonquin, which is much harder than English, by the way, and Greek and Hebrew and stuff. And so it was much harder, and yet in 14 years, he does what they did in 7 years. So it's kind of amazing, one person, his commitment to this, and his self-discipline, his persistence in working through this on a kind of a daily basis. Now, some translation issues come up. Whenever you go between cultures and languages, you have cultural differences and you have language differences. And so whenever you go between the two languages, especially when the cultures are so diverse, you're going to end up with difficulties, okay? So when you start out with the Lord's Prayer, Our Father, which art in heaven, to think of God as Father was really, really foreign to the Indians. Okay, so when you say, Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be your name, that notion of thinking of God as your Father was a real breakthrough for them. And then, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, or our debtors, forgive our debtors as we forgive our debtors. And for the Indians, revenge was a really big part of their culture. What do you mean, I got to forgive my enemy? We don't do this here. And so this kind of thing of forgiving your enemies, their trespasses, was a very big deal. Now, let me go into the book of Psalms. Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down by green pastures and things. The Lord is my shepherd. And scratch their heads, what's a shepherd? What's a shepherd? They don't know what a shepherd is. They go hunting and they hunt, turkeys and deer and rabbits, and they hunt things, beaver, and they hunt things, but they don't know what it is to have, herds of goats and sheep and goats, that you're a shepherd. They knew nothing of that. And so the Lord is my shepherd. What does that mean for the Indian and their culture and things? Very, very difficult and stuff. So some of these things were Eliot had to face and to work with these cultural difficulties. Cotton Mather wrote this book, Magnalia Americana Christi, or Christi Americana, I keep forgetting, in 1702, in which in 1702, Cotton Mather looks back at the people, first generation type people, back in the 1620s, 1630s, 1640s, and describes the history up to that point of 1702. In this Magnalia Americana Christi, or Christi Americana. Cotton Mather speaks about the difficulty of this English language, and he kind of makes a thing playing with the Tower of Babel. Remember the confounding of language in Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel. And so Cotton Mather says this: he once put some demons he's doing this in jest, okay? Cotton Mather in his book is doing this in jest. He once put some demons upon their skill in the tongues, and found that though they could manage to understand Latin, Greek, and Hebrew very well. So the demons, they put the demons down. The demons, hey, they picked up Latin, they picked up Greek, they picked up Hebrew. That's no problem. Very well. The demons were utterly baffled by the speech of the American natives. In other words, what he's saying is this Algonquin, this Wampanoag language, so difficult that the demons couldn't figure it out. They got Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, but they couldn't do this. And Mr. Elliot must have found his task anything but easy or inviting. And so he's saying that this language is really hard. And I would confirm that. I've looked at the language. And again, I've had, Akkadian, I've had Ugaritic, I've had Hebrew, I've had Greek, I've studied Latin and German and stuff like that. And this language is much, much more difficult than anything I've ever seen. So we talked about before the lattice problem. So in Judges chapter 5, verse 28, Deborah and Barak went out to war, and Sisera and the king of Jabin, king of Hatzor, came down to meet them with their chariots. And God basically, it rained, and the Kishon River flooded. And so Sisera is running, and then the mother of Sisera, Jabin, is looking out her window, out her lattice, it says, and she looks out the lattice to see when her son's coming home with all the plunder that he beat up on the Jews and all the plunder that he got. And so she looks out the lattice. So Elliott's translating along, and he says, what do you do with this word lattice? I mean, their wigwams obviously don't have any lattice. And so he asked the people that he was translating with, well, what is it? And he described what it was like, and they said, well, it's like an eel pot. And it's like this. Remember I told you that when they did the Charles River and other rivers, they would dam them up from two sides and leave a hole in the middle, and then they put this basket made out of strips of wood and stuff to catch the fish that would have then be forced as they went downstream to swim through, and they would catch them in the basket. That's how they fished. And Elliot said, Elliot actually was an amazing guy. He just had a feeling that the eel pot was not this mother looking out her window in the lattice. It didn't match up. And so he didn't know what to do with that. So he ended up using the word lattice ut. Lattice ut. And he took the word lattice and he ended it ut, which was an Indian ending, and put that Indian ending on the word lattice. And that's what he did. So what he's doing is when he's moving between cultures, not only does he have to make up a different new alphabet that hadn't been done in 1,000 years, but he also has to make up words as he's going between cultures here in order to communicate. And he can't really communicate because they don't know what a lattice is. And so he puts words like this. And again, I point out we had the same problem in Hebrew. As modern Hebrew was developed in the 20th century, again, the word for cassette, they didn't have an ancient word based in the Bible. How do you say in the Bible cassette? You can't say it. And there was no cassettes back then, obviously. I mean, they may have had the internet, but that's right, Al Gore hadn't invented the internet yet. And so they didn't have it back in Bible times as cassette or anything electronic like that. So in modern times, they just call it cassettim. Put a Hebrew ending on it, and that's how they work with some of the new words and things. You're going to have things like internet, you're going to have things like social media and things like that. Those are all new terms, and there's no ancient forerunner to that type of thing. So you're going to end up making up words. Now the words are very long, and I've got one word here, and it means our question. And as I look it on the page, and I'll try to show it to you from the PowerPoint, this word, one word, means our question, must be at least 30 to 40 characters long. It takes a whole line. And actually, I saw that in one of Elliott's Bibles, that one line, the whole line, was taken by one word. So it's kind of an incredible language and stuff. They're very, very long words. They kind of take words and endings, put them on. Instead of having separate words for pronouns and adjectives, they basically compound them together, which makes sense for these really long words, like 30, 40 characters long. The nouns, you say nouns, I mean, go in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, German. They got, masculine and feminine, neuter nouns. Okay, almost every language has that, masculine, feminine, neuter nouns. The Indians didn't do that. They had animate versus inanimate. And so it was a whole new way of thinking about nouns as animate and inanimate. Eliot picked this stuff up. This guy was a good linguist. And some of the linguistic stuff that he did was way, way, way ahead of his time. And yet he because he wanted to communicate the scriptures with accuracy, he caught this subtle difference, nuance of between that it's not male and female, it's between animate and inanimate. And so therefore, and then he picks up the endings. An og ending for animate means plural, and for the inanimate, it's basically ash at the end of a plural. The word Jehovah, they don't have the word Jehovah. So you'll notice as you read, if you get a look at the Bible, at places in terms of Genesis, I imagine Genesis chapter 2, in other places, instead of having like we do Lord, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, whenever you see it all capitalized like that, all capitals, Lord in capitals, small capitals, that means it really is a stand-in for Jehovah or Yahweh. Okay, the Indians didn't have that, and so they did was he just used the word Jehovah and put it in there. And so you'll be reading along, and all of a sudden, boom, Jehovah will be there, and you'll say, how'd that get in there? But they didn't have a word for it, so he basically used the name of God, Jehovah, to put in there. There was no substantive verb. The verb is, which is really pretty important in many languages. The word is. They didn't have a word for is or was or became. So it was really hard. How do you say, when God says in Exodus 3:14, I am that I am, how do you say that when they don't have an am, an is verb? So Eliot faced a lot of really difficult things here, and they printed, as I said, 1,000 copies were printed. And now what's going to happen is, let me just jump way ahead. In 1675, we talked about King Philip's War and the devastation that they'd had on the peoples and the relationships between the Indians and the settlers. In 1675, when the tensions grow and they start fighting each other, one of the first things to go is they are going to burn Eliot's Bibles. And so the 1663 version of the Bible, most of those perished in the flames and were torn up and were totally destroyed by the settlers, who at that point hated the Indians because they were, killing so many people. And the Indians themselves, because they didn't like the settlers, in this Bible represented this connection with the English. So both sides burned the Bibles, Eliot's Bibles, and so there was almost none of those Bibles from 1663 left. Now it's amazing that Gordon College, in their archives, Damon DeMauro has stealthed out some of this stuff, as well as Sarah, and basically St. Germain, these two people have found Gordon College had a 1663 edition of Eliot's Bible. Do you understand there was 1,000 of them printed, most of them destroyed? That is a very, very rare book. And they had the whole thing rebound just recently in the last couple months. And it's an amazing find in the archives at Gordon College in Wenham, Massachusetts, even till this day, where I had the privilege of teaching for 20 years. So, what happens here? Well, excuse me. Okay, so a copy of the Bible then went back to England, 26 copies. One copy went to King James, and that's kind of interesting. The second edition would be printed in 1685. This is 10 years after King Philip's War. They obviously needed to get more Bibles and things, and so Samuel Green was commissioned again. James Printer, the original Indian fellow that helped with the printing in the Indian College in Harvard University in Cambridge, he was also involved in proofing the second edition. Eliot had a dickens of a time raising money for this second edition. And, obviously they did the one in 1663. He was a hero. Everybody said this is incredible, what he did. After King Philip's War, the settlers were like, hey man, we don't know whether we want to do this again. And so basically let the Indians learn to read English. Let them learn to read English, and we'll just do the English Bible thing and things. And Eliot was still pushing it because he said, no, they need the Bible in their own language kind of thing. But he didn't have any money and things, and he couldn't raise the money, and he tried raising the money, and it wasn't going anywhere. And finally he was arguing with them, or not arguing with them, he was trying to persuade them. And they basically were persuaded to do the New Testament. But if you know anything about the Indians, they love the stories of the Old Testament. And if you look at the names of some of the Indians, this is just my observation, many of their names that they took on were Old Testament characters. And so they loved the Old Testament, and the stories were there really related to them. The Indians they were into storytelling and things. And so Eliot knew this stuff, and so he said, I got to have the whole Bible. I don't want just the New Testament. I mean, New Testament's about Jesus, very important New Testament, but the Old Testament was so important and things. And so what he did was, he was not when he met a wall, he says, okay, they're not going to do it. I've got 40 pounds that because remember he was getting a salary and thing, and he apparently had saved up 40 pounds, which was a lot for him, as everything he had. And so he took the 40 pounds that he had, and this is in 1685. Do you understand? He's going to be dead in 5 years. He's 81 years old now. So this is an 81-year-old man. He takes the last 40 pounds that he has. They won't print it for him, the Old Testament stuff. And he then basically, behind kind of the society's back, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel's back, they wouldn't do it. And so he takes the 40 pounds and he has this James Printer and Samuel Green or whatever who was printing there, and has them start printing the Old Testament, realizing that his 40 pounds weren't going to go much anywhere, but he had them starting to set it up and things. Well, the society found out that he was kind of going around their back just to get it done, and so they got a little bit ticked at him, and so Elliot wrote to Mr. Boyle. You remember that Winslow and Boyle were two of his advocates. Boyle was over the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, and Edward Winslow was the one who took the documents from the Indians' confessions, the tears of repentance, and brought them, the clear sunshine, and brought them to England and published them there in England. And so Mr. Boyle basically caught John Eliot doing this around the back. And so Elliot is very much indebted to this Mr. Boyle, who helped him so much and stuff. So he says, this is John Eliot speaking, he says, "My age makes me importunate." It was like, man, I'm 81 years old. I got to get this done. I'm 81 years old. I'm not going to see this. "My age makes me importunate, and I shall depart joyfully. May I but leave the Bible among them, for it is the word of life. I desire to see it done before I die, and I am so deep in years that I cannot expect to live long. And sundry say that if I could not procure it printed while I live, it is not within the prospect of human reason, whether ever or when or how it may be accomplished." And he says, hey, if I'm out of the picture, he says, I'm an old man. I mean, I can see my death is right here. By the way, all his friends had died earlier, and he lost, as I said, he lost 4 out of his 6 children. Only 2 of his children outlived him. And so he watched the death of his, and actually just a couple years after this, his own wife is going to die. And so he realizes he's at the end of his rope here, and he just says, amen, I got to get this done. If I don't get this done, it's not going to happen. And these Indians, they need the Bible in their own language and things. So there was opposition to Eliot, we should say, too. Many people, the settlers, doubted whether the Indians really understood the gospel and what was going on, and whether they were truly faithful to it or whether they were just wanting to appease the English and things like that. A guy named Hugh Peter, minister at Salem, it's on the North Shore. You kind of get in Boston area, you get North Shore, Boston, South Shore. And so there's kind of this North Shore, South Shore difference with Boston in the middle and Charles River going in there. And so if you've been in the Boston area, you know what I'm talking about, the North Shore, Cape Ann, and Boston, and then the South Shore. And Elliot then is on the South Shore. This guy is up in Salem on the North Shore, Hugh Peter, minister at Salem, and he did great damage by the cause, calling the whole missionary scheme a hoax and alleged missionary or Indian conversions a mere cheat. So here's a minister of the gospel up in Salem and says what Eliot's doing, it's all bogus, man. It's all a cheat. And they're not really becoming real Christians and things like that, which was devastating. And said, it's this hard. He faced opposition from the settlers. The settlers didn't, after Philip's War, the settlers didn't trust the Indians anymore. And so they didn't trust them. He also then, on the other side, faced problems from the sachems, sachems and the powwows, the priests and the chiefs. The priests and the chiefs then opposed Eliot too, because now they didn't trust the English. They became Christians, and I'll tell you what happened to them. Even the Christian Indians, what happened to them. And so the sachems, the chiefs, and the priests, the powwows, did not trust the English anymore. And so there's problems on both sides that Eliot has to face. And so this is kind of the context then. And then in 1685 then, they printed the second version, the second edition of his Bible. They were printed. After that, they tried for a third edition, but there was this was in 1710, I think it was. But Eliot was long gone now, and there was nobody else who could take up his mantle. He wanted somebody following his footsteps, but nobody really could. This guy was, was one of a kind. And so it was after 1710. Then they argued basically let them read English, and so it never happened, the third edition and stuff. And so Elliott's work. If you see a 1685 edition, that's a rare book, but it's not as rare as a 1663 because those were burned, and there was only 1,000 of them printed and things. So now let's talk about King Philip's War. So that was Elliott's Bible. We just showed some of the difficulties in getting it published, printed, and also some of the translational difficulties and cultural differences that Elliott had to face there. King Philip's War, 1675, 1676, that kind of bracket. King Philip's War, they had this Pequot War. Pequot War was in 1637, but that was a minor skirmish with the Indians and the settlers, and it didn't really amount to the settlers stereotyping the Indians or the Indians stereotyping the English. And so that kind of went, it was quick and kind of over and things. In the 1770s, Elliott and Daniel Gookin, as we said before, in 1674, Elliott and Daniel Gookin went to the 14 Christian villages, the praying Indian villages, and visited them. This is a year before King Philip's War, these praying Indian villages. To put this in context, Winslow describes it like this. The King Philip's War killed more people percentage-wise than almost any war that America would ever face. And she was writing in 1968, I believe it was. So up till 1968, King Philip's War, more people percentage-wise died. Again, there weren't that many settlers, and yet the settlers were getting, scalped and killed and burned, their buildings burned, their towns burned, and things like that. Whole towns were burned down, whole families were destroyed, and it was brutal. I mean, the Indians come in, they scalp people, and they do really bad stuff. And so this King Philip's War, the English were losing. And they were losing, and they lost a huge amount of their population, and they were scared they're going to be wiped out, and the Indians were going to wipe them out, the whole group of them, and things. And so this was kind of a really tremendous bloodbath that was going on. The English, the Indians used this ambush tactic. The Indians knew how to fight in the woods, and they knew how to hide in the woods, and then they jump up and they put an ambush and they just kill the soldiers, the English soldiers and these first settlers and things like that. They were ambushed, and the English were actually losing in 1675. Initially they started out losing, and they were afraid that all their villages are going to be burned down and driven into the sea, so to speak. The praying Indians were not trusted, and certainly not the settlers and things like that. There had been this murder of this Sassamon guy, and it was one of the praying Indians in Natick. Okay, so remember, Natick was the center of this praying Indian village thing, and basically the Sassamon guy had been murdered. I think it was found in a pond that was frozen. He was murdered, and they determined that. The English then got a hold of 3 Indians that had killed him and something. They hung those Indians and killed those Indians. And then King Philip used that as the spark to start his war. That the English are, killing our people, and use this to spark the war. Kind of, it's kind of amazing sometimes how wars get sparked over something that is not really worthy of a war. But anyways, he used that. And the Indians were then lumped together, and they were deprived of guns, they were deprived of the scarcity of food going on, and then this happened. The settlers didn't know that they could trust these Christian Indians, or what they call praying Indians. Elliott's praying Indians, can they trust them? In other words, you trust one of these praying Indians, and then you actually get in the conflict, and one of the praying Indians, tries to take your scalp. Okay, and so they didn't know whether they could trust them or not. So what they did was they rounded up these praying Indians in Natick and these places, the 14 villages, and they brought them down to the Charles River, and basically there were boats waiting on the Charles River. They boated them, and Elliott then he himself came there and bid his Indian friends goodbye, and they took them out to Deer Island. And I've got some videos and some pictures I took in 360 at Deer Island today. Today it's connected just below Winthrop on the North Shore there. But and those days there was no connection. It was out in the harbor, Boston Harbor. Now this is, the Atlantic Ocean, the harbor, and they put them out there through the middle of winter. And if you know anything about the winters in New England, they can be really pretty rough. And apparently that was a rough winter that they were put out there. They said the snow was up to their shoulders. I've had that 20 feet from me where I've had to dig this snow out of my sidewalk down to the street, and it was up to, and I've had piles of snow 6 and 7 feet high on both sides. Don't recommend digging snow when you get old like me anymore, but that's when you get a snowblower. But these people didn't have that, and so they're put out there. There's no food, there's no shelter, and these Indians are put out on Deer Island in the middle of this harbor in the Atlantic, and basically many of them died. And so this is really rough stuff. There's a memorial, and I'll show it to you in these pictures. There's a memorial out on Deer Island now commemorating what happened to these Christian, quote, praying Indians during King Philip's War. It was devastating. It was devastating. Here are some images of Deer Island. And as you can see now, it's just across the shore from Logan Airport. Just south of Winthrop there. There's a connecting kind of isthmus thing going on now. It was an island back then. And the Indians were put out there, and many of them did not survive the terrible winter of 1675, 1676. Here's a quick panorama on the top of the hill on Deer Island. And a couple things happened there. There was no shelter, as we said. Hundreds of Indians were put out there. Many of them died. One of the things that was kind of, Elliott knew that these guys were out on Deer Island, and Deer Island's kind of up here, Roxbury's down here. There's quite a bit of a way to sail across to get it, okay, across the harbor, the Charles River there where it comes out. Elliott then got in a small boat with Daniel Gookin, and they're basically taking some foodstuffs out to these Indians on Deer Island. So they're in this small boat and they're going across. It's a good ways. I mean, I don't know, a couple miles, something like that, across an open harbor. I mean, it's a good ways. And one of the bigger ships that was run by the settlers came up, saw Gookin and Elliott, and they rammed their boat and basically sunk and rammed the boat, and Elliott was cast into the water. Now, you remember, this guy is lame, man. He can't walk. One of his legs gone. If you ever hit the water in the Atlantic off the Boston here, and especially in the fall and winter, it's cold. I mean, this isn't like a let's go for a swim kind of thing. It's cold. You can die of hypothermia. So they hit the boat. Now, they said, oh, it was just an accident. It was just, yeah, right. If you saw the harbor, they hit the boat. That was done on purpose. Most people believe, and if you look at the circumstances, I think can document that they rammed them, and they rammed with this big boat, rammed this little boat. Elliott was cast into the sea, and they had to drag him out of there, lest he die and stuff. And so this is what the settlers, in other words, didn't want Elliott taking foodstuffs to help the Indians on Deer Island. But Elliott put his own life at risk in order to help these Indians and stuff, because they were his friends. He believed in them, and they were Christians, Christian brothers. And so this was some things there. However, what happened, that was 1665, and the Indians were winning, the settlers were losing, and it was almost going to go down the tubes. And what happened is then the settlers decided that they could trust some Indians. And so some of the Indians were brought back in and used as scouts. And they then started ambushing the Indians in reverse. And they also used these scouts to figure out where the Indians were before, so they wouldn't get captured. Once they started using the Indians and using them as scouts and various, I don't know what you'd call it militarily, but basically the war started flipping around and turned around. And King Philip was finally killed. And once he was killed, basically the war fizzled. Okay, they needed his leadership. And he wasn't much of a leader, to be honest with you, but he was able to rabble-rouse all these Indians to go out and kill the settlers. Elliot was viewed, people's view of Elliot changed with King Philip's War. Before, he was this great hero that was out trying to missionary evangelize the Indians, and he was translating the Bible. It was incredible what he did. Now he's viewed as helping the Indians who are killing us, and so therefore he was looked at as kind of a traitor. And you get this thing that because he sided with the Indians, he drew great criticism. And even my own son faced this when he was in Afghanistan, when he did favors and things for the Afghan people and protected them, that some of his own Marines called him a Haji lover, which was the lowest of the low. You can't go lower than that. And then there was grave consequences for my son because he was a, quote, Haji lover. And all he was trying to do is saying, we need to help these people rather than, muscle them and show how big and strong we are and things. And so anyways, Elliot was in that same thing where he was helping the Indians, and the settlers then, they didn't like Elliot. They saw him kind of as a turncoat, as helping the people that were killing him and stuff. So Elliot also, when they captured these Indians, sometimes they would kill them, the settlers, as they killed them, they captured the Indians, they would sell them to the West Indies, okay? And they would sell these Indians then as slaves, basically, down to the West Indies. Elliot then really objected to this. And he said, no, you shouldn't be doing that, man. And so anyways, he objected to this enslavement of the Indians after the war and in the process of the war. So the whole thing, there's a change of ethos here. The 14 Indian villages, 10 of them were left in shambles and burned to the ground and just left in shambles, and fire and theft and all sorts of stuff happened. And so 10 of the 14 disappeared. Natick was largely, remember Natick was, we showed you in the map and things south of Boston. Natick was one of the only ones that was rebuilt. And Elliot then, it was interesting, he still preached over in Natick, and so he'd go between Roxbury and Natick as he had done. He finally got this guy, Daniel Tokawapate, in 1683. And now Elliot's what, he must be about 82, 83 at this time. Now that would be actually make him 79. Or thereabouts, I forget, you'd have to add it up. But anyways, so he's in the late 70s, early 80s. And this guy, Daniel, basically is an Indian who now becomes pastor of the Natick church. And when I was inside the Natick church, they have a list of all their pastors. And you can see that this is the first Indian pastor that they had. Elliot basically worked on getting him ordained and put in that church before he passed away. And so this is a big deal. The problem was that after Daniel Tokawapate died, then basically he was the last. The English then took over that church. And so after him, there's just all English people, and I figure when he passed away. But anyways, after that, then it's all English, took over the church in Natick even. So some of the Tewksbury Indians fled into the wilderness, and they tried to get them to return. Okay, the Indians fled into the wilderness after the process of this war, and the Indians responded like this, quote, "We are not sorry for what we leave behind, but we are sorry that the English have driven us away from praying to God and from our leader. We did begin to understand a little of praying to God." These are the praying Indians, Tewksbury. They fled into the wilderness because they're afraid they're going to get killed in this war. And they said, we're not coming back, man. And we're sorry. What we left behind, our goods and stuff, we don't regret that. But we regret leaving we were just starting to learn about praying to God and stuff, and we really regret that. But the efforts to Christianize the Indians were never resumed with interest and zeal that was formerly felt. So this is King Philip's War, 1675. All of Elliot's efforts and things, the towns that were there, the Indian praying towns, basically all collapsed except for Natick. They had to rebuild. Elliott's now 72, or so he's got failing strength. He never got over his sciatica and his lameness in his leg. He writes to Robert Boyle back in England, who's over the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. He says, I am lamed and quite disabled. And so he's traveling back and forth. I don't know how he did it. And facing the loss of most of the Indian Bibles as a result of the war, it was devastating to him. In a letter to Robert Boyle, again, he lamented the loss and pled for another edition to be printed. My age makes me importunate, he said. I shall depart joyfully. May I but leave the Bible among them, for it is the word of life, and there be some godly souls among them that live thereby. And they need the Bible in their own language. So he writes Robert Boyle, and then we talked about some of the shenanigans. Even Richard Baxter, who had been his great spiritual support, who was in England, Richard Baxter, the great Puritan, had written Eliot back and forth. But after this happened with the Bibles burning and stuff, even Richard Baxter said, let's not do another one of these Bibles kind of thing. And so we talked about how Eliot kind of did this sneaky routine and got it done. That's right. In 1610, after the 1685, they tried to do a third edition, but it just wouldn't go. People wouldn't buy into it and things. I want to kind of finish up now with kind of the final days of John Eliot. I think you can gather that I have tremendous amount of respect for this man. It's rarely in my life that I've read a story that is so compelling as the stories of John Eliot and the Indians and their confessions of Christ and their confession of their own sin and things like that. Repentance and confession like that I've rarely seen in my lifetime. And I've never seen, this guy is an amazing guy. On his 80th birthday, Nehemiah Walter, remember how I told you they like these Old Testament names, Nehemiah Walter, on his 80th birthday of Eliot in Roxbury, he got another minister came into Roxbury. He's 80 years old. Finally, another minister comes in. Eliot then gives up his salary. He said to the church, hey man, you guys don't have enough money to pay me and stuff. I give up my salary. Let Nehemiah Walter take it and things like that. But the people were so how should I say, he had ministered to these people since 1632, and now it's what, in the 1680s, and for 60 years or whatever, and they owed so much to him that they said, no, we'll keep paying you, and you got your house and your things like that. And he's in his 80s, he's getting old. His wife died in 1687. 1687 is 3 years before Eliot himself would die. His wife Hannah died. It was devastating. Only his son Joseph and his oldest daughter Hannah survived. He had lost all his other children, 4 other children before that, and now Hannah dies, which is devastating to him. They were quite a couple. Eliot had a sense of humor. Got to give it to him. So he's getting very old now. And all this first-generation settlers, remember how we talked about the first-generation settlers? People like Richard Mather, Thomas Hooker, who had been the founder of Hartford and then the governor of Connecticut and also had been his mentor. John Cotton, famous early Puritan preacher in the First Church of Boston, died at 67. John Wilson, who he substituted in when he was in the First Church of Boston, he also passed away 20, 30 years earlier. Mather died, Hooker died, Cotton died. So all these first generation, and Eliot lives to be 87. He dies in 1690. From 1604 to 1690. So he outlived them, many of them by 20 years. He outlives them. And so he, with a sense of humor, he says his old acquaintances, this is the Richard Mathers and the John Cottons and those people, his old acquaintances had gone to heaven so long before him that he was afraid they would think that he had gone the wrong way because he had stayed so long behind. And so, of course, he says, all my friends, the Mathers and the Cottons and the John Wilson and Thomas Shepard, they all died. And it was so long that they probably were up in heaven trying to think that, man, where'd John Eliot go? And they probably think, man, he must have gone the wrong place because we're all here and he's gone. And so you can see his sense of humor with that, but that also showing that he lived beyond the generation of the first settlers, kind of into the second generation of settlers, but he has this. And so it's good for me too, with all this bashing of America that we've got on now, to see some of these first settlers and to see their passion for Christ, their passion to help and things like this, the Indians and things like this. And why aren't these stories told? And so this is part of what I'm doing here with on YouTube, to tell this story and things, say this is an amazing guy. You don't look around. Today, you look around and you say, well, we're the greatest. No. We don't have a candle to these kind of people like John Elliott and the stuff that he did. Just were really amazing. Amazing man. Truly, God had his hand on him in really powerful ways. His own reflection on aging. Now, John Elliott is getting old now, and he reflects on aging. As I'm getting old, I reflect, and so I really appreciate his comments. Again, a little bit of sense of humor here. John Elliott says, my understanding leaves me. Been there. My memory fails me. Been there. My utterance fails me. But I thank God my charity holds out still. In other words, I can't remember things. I can't, verbalize things the way I used to. My memory fails me. My understanding fails me. But my charity, his kindness, still holds strong. And I got to give it to him. This guy is kind of amazing thing. He dies, and as he was getting old in his 80s, after he gave up his ministerial thing, you come over to Elliott's house, guess what you see? John Elliott, this 86-year-old man, ministering to and getting little children, black children, Indian children, and white children, and catechizing them, teaching them how to read and how to write and these types of things. And that's what he did at the end of his life. So Indian black children would gather around his chair as he taught them how to read and write. And this is how he spends the end of his life. Amazing guy, 86 years old. His last words when he passes at 86, actually, in 1690 were, welcome, joy. And he passes from the scene. And Samuel Sewall, a judge on the witch trials, actually, and we may have more on him later, but he narrates the death and burial of John Elliott. On the tomb in Roxbury to this day, it says, here lie the remains of John Elliott, apostle to the Indians, ordained over the First Church of Roxbury, in November 5th, 1632, died May 20th, 1690, at age 86. The Natick Village Church lasted 26 years under Daniel Tocqueville, and then in 1716, Daniel passed, and then the English took over from 1716 on and things. I want to read a series of tributes to John Elliott, and these tributes are amazing. Just his own comment on his own view of himself. He looked at himself as, I am but a shrub in the wilderness. Guy had humility after he'd done these incredible things that one individual could do. I look a shrub in the wilderness, he wrote to Robert Boyle. My doings, this is Eliot speaking to Robert Boyle, my doings, alas, they have been poor and small and lean doings, and I will be the man who shall throw the first stone at all of them. In other words, Eliot says, what I did was very small, really, and stuff. He says, I'll be the first one to throw a stone at my own works. And they're small, lean, and poor. And you just say, this guy is truly humble and really did amazing things. And yet when he didn't puff his head up, I am the great John Elliott, missionary to apostle to the Indians. No, never went to his head. He was able to, really hold his humility and his kindness and his charity never left him. He left behind evidences of what one man's dedication can mean. His persistence and dedication to his friends, both at Roxbury and at Natick, the Indians and things. Winslow writes, he was not an intellectual. He was a very bright man and in a lot of ways, but he was not an intellectual. He was not a statesman. He did not enrich the nation's art in any direction. He was a very simple man, simple in his acceptance of the Bible as the Word of God himself, simple in his trust that God prospers and the endeavors of those who believe that he will prosper them, simple in his assumption that all men, even those who are degraded, are God's children. It is this simplicity, in this simplicity lay his strength. It's the first generation of American colonists and settlers and things. His life work is represented, and I went down to South Boston. I'm not a native of South Boston, but I went down there and started studying these things, and there's all sorts of streets named Elliott Street, spelled the same way with one L and one T. Elliott Street. Newton has those streets, Jamaica Plains. Churches, there are all sorts of churches named after Elliott. The one in Natick, I showed you the pictures. I went up and took just recently pictures of the Elliott Church in Lowell, where my wife works on the North Shore here. Schools are named after him. He started schools in the Roxbury Latin School, oldest school in the country, and also in Jamaica Plains, the first integrated school, blacks, Indians, and whites, all there. Still to this day, Jamaica Plains, the Elliott School, is still there in existence, and I think I showed you some pictures of that. Signs commemorating his work, and you go over southern Canton area, Natick area, Newton area, and you see these signs commemorating the work of John Elliott, basically back in the 1640s, and that stuff coming to this day. Carved in stone on the congregational the front of the Congregational Library and Archive on Beacon Street, right next to the State House building, is carved in stone. And then the murals built. The murals built in the Natick post office. It's kind of an interesting mural if you ever get in there. But anyways, there's a mural of John Elliott speaking to the Indians, and then also the mural in the State House, the massive gold dome State House by the Boston Commons. You go in there and you go to the Hall of Flags, and you look up, and there is a huge mural of John Elliott speaking to the Indians till this day. And concluding tributes, okay? Concluding tribute. And this was done for Gordon College. They had an exhibit of the 1663 Bible of Eliot, and they had an exhibit. Dr. Damon DeMauro set that up, and Sarah St. Germain set that up. It was wonderful. And they had the Bible there. They had just had it rebound. And let me read this. When we take that old dark volume into our hands, we understand not the words in which it is written, but it has another and beautiful meaning, which we do understand. It is a symbol of affection which a devoted man cherished for the soul of his fellow man. It is the expression of benevolence which fainted in no effort to give light to those who sat in darkness. What a beautiful statement about Eliot. And though we do not understand the words of that book, what it represents is his love and his persistence and stuff. It has been said, probably without exaggeration, that Mr. Eliot was the most successful missionary that ever preached the gospel to Indians. I want to read a tribute now from a guy named Francis, Converse Francis, in the end of his book. He says, "We justly admire the moral courage, the spirit of self-sacrifice, which sustained Eliot in the tasks of preaching, visiting, and instruction, never deterred, never daunted by the fierce threats, never moved by exposure to storms and cold and various forms of physical suffering. But when we represent him to our minds as laboring at his translation of the scriptures in the silence of his study year after year, in the freshness of the morning hour, and by the taper of midnight, wearied but not disheartened, continually perplexed with almost unimaginable phraseology of the dialect, and yet always patient and to discover how it might be made to represent truly the meaning of the sacred books, doing this chapter by chapter, verse by verse, without a wish to give over the toil." What was Eliot's name spelled backwards? Toil. Toil-E. "Cherishing for a long time only faint hope of publication, yet still willing to believe that God in his good providence would finally send the means of giving the printed word of life to those for whom he toiled and prayed. We cannot but feel that we witness a more trying task, a more surprising labor than any present by the stirring and active duties of his ministry among the natives." And then here's another fellow citing his kind of eulogy for John Elliott. A nobler, truer, warmer spirit than John Elliott never lived. And as I look at this, I say I've rarely read, even in church history, anybody that could hold a candle to this guy. And I look this, and it really inspires me on to love and good works. And I wish our people could look back on some of these people and say, wow, they weren't perfect. They were also people of their time. But wow, what an amazing way that John Elliott loved these Indians and gave his life for them self-sacrificially. So a warmer spirit than John Elliott never lived. And taking state of country and the narrowness of means and the rudeness of the age into consideration, the history of the church, Christian church, does not contain an example of resolute, untiring, successful labor superior to that of translating the entire scriptures into the language of the native tribes of Massachusetts, a labor performed not in the flush of youth, nor with the luxurious abodes of academic ease, but under the constant burden of his duties as a minister and a preacher, and at the time in his life when the spirits begin to flag. In other words, he did it as a kind of an old man. It's kind of amazing. And so this is my tribute to Jonathan Elliott. I pray that God may raise up, even in our day, people that love and are persistent and diligent and serve God with the power of the Holy Spirit, as John Elliott did to the praying Indians in the 1600s. Thank you for watching this series. May God raise up and revive. May we see revival in our times. Thank you. This is Dr. Ted Hildebrandt in his teaching on John Elliott, 1604 to 1690, Apostle to the Indians. This is session number 3, the Elliott Bible, 1663, second edition, 1685, King Philip's War, 1675, and Starting Over, and then finally, final tributes to John Elliott.